Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Getting the Results Employing DE&I in Western New York. I'm just thrilled to have you all here and to talk about the results of our foundational assessment of the Western New York business community. This is really important work as we're trying to advance equity in our region. And when we decided to do this assessment/survey, our goal is to really measure where the community is and where we're going. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Dottie Gallagher, the president and CEO of the Buffalo Niagara Partnership. And we are excited to share with you the results of our study. And at this moment, you all can download it if you haven't already. And we will obviously be walking through some of the very specific data, although not all of it. And I'm inviting you all to submit your questions and answers. We'll get to as many of them as we can during the presentation. So thank you all for being here. One of the goals of this report is for us to really help the employer community get the services and products and support they need to advance equity work. So you're going to see, and we see in this report, some really rich data around that and how we will move this conversation forward. Our role, we see ourselves at the partnership as really sort of the co-op for the employer community, where we bring together their needs and we try to deliver that to them. And we do that work with the help of some really important volunteers. Listed on the screen right now are Diversity and Inclusion Executive Committee members. This group has been brought together to really evaluate the work that we're doing as we're doing it, and to give their advice and counsel. So they will see, for example, all of the evaluations from all of our products and services, and really hold us accountable about the work that we are doing in this space. So our work wouldn't be possible without the work of these volunteers, and I just pause a moment to thank all of them. This undertaking was fairly significant financially and otherwise. In fact, this survey assessment has been, I'm sorry, I apologize about using those words interchangeably, because we really don't want this to be a survey. We want it to be a self-assessment for businesses, and more importantly, an assessment of the community. But you're going to hear me mess that up pretty much throughout the whole presentation. I haven't gotten it straight yet, but anyway, we've gotten tremendous support through the Community Foundation of Greater Buffalo and the Walmart Foundation in doing this work. We also got financial support from an anonymous group of business leaders to do this survey. And as I mentioned, it was in development for over a year, and I'll talk about the history and the timing of how we got to where we are. But we also want to thank some in-kind support that we have gotten. Special thanks to Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York for donating the printing and distribution of the report, and Tom Burns, local photographer, for his expert photography, and to Crowley Webb for providing additional survey expertise and helping us with the layout design. And with us on the call today is their chief researcher, Andrea Berchinucci, who will be presenting in a moment as well. So I want to thank everyone for making this really possible. So to talk about the history, as I mentioned, when we developed this idea a year ago, the founding principle and what Walmart really wanted us to do was to be able to do an assessment that the results were projectable to the community at large. Because this is not only about an individual employer, it's really about where are we as a community, where are we right now, and where is it that we want to go in terms of building equity. And so if we do the assessment and the results are not projectable to the community, we don't get to the full goal. So we spent a lot of time talking to the Race Matters Institute, the Business Leaders Task Force of the Racial Equity Roundtable, and conferring with some experts nationally. Our friends at the Greater Cleveland Partnership were tremendous asset in helping us think this through, as were the Philadelphia Chamber that does similar assessment. And in the Cleveland and Philadelphia, who are really premier organizations in this work in their communities, even those surveys are not, their assessments are not projectable to the community at large. So we try to tackle the challenge of how do we make this really projectable, and the answer is you'll see is in the results, is that the assessment is built in a way to really measure people's perceptions about where they are as an organization and where they want to go, as opposed to sort of compliance oriented, how many people of color do you have in management, et cetera. So a guiding principle of the development of this assessment was, if you had to go to the EEO office to get an answer, we probably are not going to get the kind of response we want, because again, we're trying to move the community forward. On our team, Laura Smith, who's also with us today, our Vice President of Economic Development, really corralled this effort and did a fantastic job in doing so. So thank you, Laura. And I'm going to ask Laura and Andrea to turn their cameras on now, because we're going to get into the meat of this, and we're going to start by looking at the how we did the survey assessment and what the respondent demographics look like. So Andrea, I'm going to turn it over to you here now.
Yes, thank you, Dottie. And hello, everyone. So as Dottie mentioned, this business assessment, it comprised a web survey, which was less than 10 minutes to take. We conducted the research back in June, and we gave 2 weeks to respondents to be able to participate. We distributed the survey via email. We used a list that was provided to us by the Buffalo Niagara Partnership and 20 additional organizations that are economic, development, trade, and chamber organizations. We only terminated if respondents reported working at a company with fewer than 6 employees. Everybody else was eligible to participate. We ended up with a total sample size of 265 individuals, which represent 250 community companies. And as Dottie mentioned earlier, this is great. We were very pleased with this sample size because findings are projectable to the community. Based on the businesses in area Niagara County, at a 95% confidence level, we have less than 6%. I think it's exactly 5.9% error rate, plus minus. If you look at this slide, we see we have different company sizes participating. The majority were between 11 and 50 employees, but we also had 22% that have 500 plus employees. When it comes to company industry, again, we have a wide range of companies participated. The largest were nonprofit, followed by manufacturing and construction. When it comes to age, we had a nice distribution there, and gender was almost evenly distributed between male and female. And when it comes to job title, it's an interesting story here, because based on the email list that was provided to us, we were really targeting executive level respondents here. And we ended up with 77% of the sample being executives, but we almost picked up, also picked up 23% of staff level, administrative level respondents as well. And that's just gave us an additional nice way to look at the survey. And we were able to look at these two segments and look at significant differences when it comes to perception between executive level and staff level respondents. And Dottie is going to talk about the findings, and we have a couple of slides to show you those significance here. I'm gonna give it back to Dottie here.
Thanks, Andreas. So I want to, just before we move on to the actual results, our friends in Philadelphia who do this were only able to secure 150 company responses. So by order of magnitude, to talk about, the value of having this sort of foundational research to be able to project to the community is really, I think, unprecedented. At least we haven't found it yet. And I think it's worth talking about the why. I told you a little bit about the survey assessment construction, not having to go to the EEO office to get an answer, but there were a couple of other major factors here. And Andrea touched on one. We had a list that that the partnership had put together of 20 economic development organizations for the purpose of the Western New York Business Impact COVID study. And that list was 10,000 businesses. And as we were getting ready to conduct that study, we also solicited any business that wasn't on the list who wanted to take the impact study, which was about another 1,000 businesses. So we didn't have it, but our research company had this list of unique companies. And that was a great leg up. But our original intention was to do this in March, to send out this assessment in March, to have the results in time for our June Diversity and Inclusion Summit and release them there. COVID hit, we shelved it. We said this is not the right time, for obvious reasons. And those of you who are connected to the partnership know that, we literally reorganized our staff. We were helping people figure out how to shut down and then helping people how to figure out reopen. And we just knew we weren't going to, after all this heavy investment in time and expertise and money, quite frankly, we were not going to get the response rate we needed if we tried to do this in March. So we shelved it. And we honestly, at the time, thought we would have to shelve it until January of 21. And then, unfortunately, when George Floyd was murdered and we saw so many companies making statements around equity and really talking about their commitment to improving equity, we all had a conversation, said maybe this is the moment to put the assessment out. If businesses are really trying to work their way through this challenge right now, maybe this will be a resource to them. And so when we look at this and we look at sort of the historical challenges of getting a sort of representative sample, it was really a great deal of planning, this fantastic agreement we had among our community development partners, because we had to call them back and ask them, can we have your permission to use your list for this purpose? That really allowed us to get the results we have today. So I hope when we repeat this 2 years from now, we will have an equally good response rate. But I think it is telling that all these factors coming together, that there was, I'm going to say, some good that came out of the horror that we all experienced with the unrest that we've witnessed. So Andrea also mentioned another thing, which was we were pointing at CEOs. And why were we pointing at CEOs or C-suite executives? And that is because all of the best research on racial equity in terms of inclusive workplaces really points to the fact that the CEO must be driving this change. So if we're doing an assessment that says, where is our community and how many CEOs are really bought in, that's who we want to take the assessment. Well, as Andrea mentioned, we did get responses from staff level that were, 75 and 25. And really it added, it gets really, this is sort of a lesson in inclusion, really. We went out to just talk to CEOs, and because we had a more inclusive audience take the survey, the results are far more robust than they would have been otherwise. And in fact, I think really helping us define many of the recommendations as we're moving forward. So with that background, we'll jump right in. And a reminder, you can submit a question if you'd like at any point. So let's talk about this, and we're going to look at this and we're going to talk about companies that have begun the D&I journey. Then we're going to talk about companies that have not begun their journey and what recommendations we see moving forward. So of the companies that have begun their DEI journey, and you can see here, 72% of the businesses that took the assessment report they have begun their journey, and that is their definition of beginning. So there's a very wide, vast, way to determine that. If a CEO takes this and they went to a seminar and they said, I want to talk to my staff about this, in their minds, maybe that's beginning. Perhaps there's a training program, or they are further down the road, they've begun. So we don't know exactly what beginning means. But that's okay, because again, we're measuring perceptions and where we're going. You'll see how this all works together. 45% of those that have begun they report having everyone in their organization committed to diversity and inclusion. 21% have, actually 41% have put some form of infrastructure in place. 21% have a person in charge, and 20% have a committee in charge of the process. Now we ask the question, have you set concrete goals? 17% of those, of that 72 have set concrete goals, and 5% of companies have achieved the goals that they have set. So this is what I like to call the opportunity landscape, right? So this is, good intent. We're starting at 72%, but yet only 5% of businesses are achieving the goals they've set out for themselves. So when we talk about this being a foundational assessment, the next time we do this, we'd like to see all of those numbers go up, right? The ultimate measure is, are people setting goals and measuring goals and achieving goals, and therefore driving the kind of change we're talking about. One interesting point on this slide is that there was no statistical significant difference in for-profit, not-for-profit, type of industry across the spectrum of those that have begun the journey. So I'll pause for a second here to ask Laura and Andrea if they have anything they want to add before we move on to the next slide. Nope. Okay. So then let's look at the companies that have not begun their DEI journey. 27% of businesses say they haven't started. That's the bad news. Although I have to say, I was surprised to see, I don't know, and you guys can nod, I was surprised to see 72% yes, right? Because that feels like we're not having to, convince people that this is the right thing to do, that the vast majority of companies want to do and are doing some form of the right thing. So of the companies that have not yet started the D&I journey, there was a little more good news. 12% said they didn't have any process, but that they plan to in the near future. And 15% said they did not have any process and they don't have plans. What was a little troubling was that 6% said they don't wish to initiate plans for D&I processes. They don't need to for whatever reason. And we'll talk about that later, deeper into the presentation. But we should note here that the industries more likely to not have begun the D&I journey were construction and manufacturing industries. So we know that for sure. So with this framework of what the universe looks like right now, really the question is, well, what do we learn, right? Well, the first thing we learned that getting started is very important. And I hope you can read these individual bars. And again, all this data is in the report you can download, and there's more data in there. But this is what you're looking at here is a comparison of companies that have begun the journey, and companies by companies, again, I want to define as both for-profit, not-for-profit companies, and then yet to begin the journey is green. So what you're really looking at here is the gap between the blue and the green, right? So the statement that says, my organization maintains a culture that promotes inclusion. 75% of companies that report having started the journey agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. So that's what you're looking at here. Agree and strongly agree. So as you can see, if you go all the way down, the gap starting is incredibly important. It is an effort that really begins to put meat on the bone in terms of moving things forward, and really, I think, points out for us where a lot of the work is to be done. So I'll pick another one here. If you go to the second column, the fourth one down, look at the gap, the last two. Actually, we're going to look at that gap in a minute. So let me take another one. Leaders ensure equity is promoted by using the organization's budget. So 45%, which isn't great, right? If you've begun the journey and only less than 50% do not agree that they have promoted equity in the organization's budget. But look, if you haven't started D&I journey, 13% agree and strongly agree. So getting started is critically important to actually beginning to move the needle. We also learned that building an infrastructure improves outcomes. And this slide, what you're looking at are companies that had 50 or fewer employees. Those are the darker green, and companies that had more than 250 employees. Because we hear a lot of explanations, and I'm going to talk about objections or barriers or or really explanations is probably a better, more neutral term. But one of the things we frequently hear from smaller companies is they can't put together an infrastructure. They don't have the people or the resources. And one of the surprising learnings out of our assessment is that, look at 16% of companies 50 or fewer have set up, have a person in charge of D&I processes. It's probably not that person's full-time job, but they have appointed a person to be in charge. 13% have a committee. They have 78% have everyone in the workplace committed to D&I, and 14% set concrete goals. That's impressive, I think, because when you look at the first slide that said 17% of all companies have set concrete goals, this is, I think, an impressive number. And we do know that larger companies are more likely to have an infrastructure than small, but we also know that this effort to create an infrastructure does improve outcomes. That's one of the things we learned in the survey, which you'll see in a minute. But again, I'll pause here in case Laura or Andrea have something they'd like to add. No? Oh, okay. I'm doing a good job today. I'm not forgetting anything. Great. All right. So as we say, the results improve when you have an infrastructure in place. So what we're looking at here are companies that have a point person or a committee versus those that do not, right? So if you are a company that has some form of infrastructure in place, you agree or strongly agree or agree that you have by a factor of 32% concrete D&I goals, double what a company that does not have an infrastructure. So you are far more likely to have accountabilities built in and measurable goals built in if you have put a form of infrastructure in place. And really these numbers speak for themselves. But Andrea or Laura, is there anything you want to add about any of these specific observations here? And Andrea, just refresh my memory. Is this still agree or strongly agree on this, or was this yes or no? Yes,
no, it's the scale of agreement. And also just to add here, like you can see, as Dottie mentioned, that once you have an infrastructure in place, like it's almost double, double as the bar. However, we have to keep in mind that there's still growth, opportunity for both, both companies that have or not have an infrastructure in place, which hopefully in 2 years from now, we will see a big lift there.
Right. There's a lot of opportunity for improvement in all of these numbers. And interestingly enough, the highest agree or strongly agree were around recruitment efforts. And you'll see in a minute, the data shows that that's where a lot of the arrows are pointed, and maybe that's an opportunity for correction as we move this work forward. So you're absolutely right, Andre, and I'm glad you brought that up, because when I presented this to our board of directors, I said the same thing. None of these numbers are really as spectacular in terms of the level of goals that are being established overall. So if only 32% of companies have set concrete goals, that's, whatever, we got a lot of opportunity there in terms of even organizations that have an infrastructure and committee to move that forward. And as you say, this is part of what we want to measure, is as we're looking, are we actually moving the needle to outcomes-based efforts that are really measurable. But interestingly enough, one of the other surprises of the research is that having an infrastructure in place alone is not enough to really move the needle. So here what you're looking at is agree or strongly agree of those companies. So of those companies that have a point person or committee, they have an infrastructure in place. Look at the opportunity here. Doesn't mean that, so only 41% of those companies agree or strongly agree that leadership ensure that equity is in place in the company's talent management systems. So there's a lot of work to do here, and a lot of work where we believe we can really learn from one another. And that's part of, again, what the partnership plans to do, is to provide this environment for companies to learn from one another so that we can advance the work on behalf of the community. So we gave you a little bit of a preview earlier about this notion about CEOs seeing things differently than staff, and we want to go through that with you now. this is perceptions by respondent level. So, and I understand we're comparing a lot of things here, and I'm walking you through a lot of things and a lot of different bars and what we're comparing to what, and it's a lot of information to take in. So, and I'm told I talk too fast. Laura, am I still talking too fast? Okay. But what we're comparing here is the perceptions of the same questions. If you responded to the survey in a CEO level seat, or if you were in a staff or management level seat. And again, what you're looking for here is the difference in the bar. So CEOs have a much higher strongly agree perception that their organizations maintain a culture that promotes inclusion, equity, and diversity. But their staff, by a factor of almost 20 points, don't quite see it that way. So what does that mean? Is it a failure to communicate the work that's being done in a C-suite level, or is it a failure to be truly inclusive, right? You're starting efforts, but are you engaging in an inclusive way? And what does inclusive mean? It means being able to, be your authentic self, feel seen and heard at work, and that your input is valued, right? So the point is here, if as a CEO, if you're kind of doing all the right stuff, but you aren't actually being more inclusive, you're going to see you potentially could see a gap like this. Or it could be that your organization is not doing a good job of communicating the work that you're doing. So I'll tell a little story here, but there are 12 major companies in Buffalo that are doing a procurement initiative with their procurement offices. They're names of the companies that you all know. They're major employers. They've put time and money into actually doing minority procurement of local businesses, and their pilot project, they're 2 years into a pilot, and they've really made some great strides and are achieving their goals, which are measured and reported on. And I have the privilege of sitting at that table. But none of those companies are telling the rest of their staff that they're doing this work, right? Because it's a pilot project and they just want to make sure they get it right. So you can be doing the right thing, but if you're not communicating the right thing, you're essentially missing an opportunity here. But what's interesting also is that CEOs and staff agree on the areas for improvement. And this is really where we see tremendous opportunities. So when you look at this slide, here you're looking at, and what we picked were anything that less than 50% of CEO level respondents did not agree or strongly agree. So this is the bottom of the pile. So it talks about, all the improvements that we need to make around equity and talent management systems, equity promoted in organizations' budgets, professional development for managers, D&I training for staff, and equity and vendor selection. And I'm going to spend a little more time with this, but I think to me this is interesting. So we all kind of see where the problem areas are, which I think, again, is really directional for the work that we're doing and helping companies move forward. And I think one of the things that really stands out to me is a unanimity of thought here around professional development, both with managers and training for staff. And I know in my own personal experience, going down this road, the more I know, or the more I think I know, the more I realize I don't know, how much my own lived experience has created my own perceptions of the work. And the more I learn, the more I need to learn. So it's not enough to say, we're going to have a diversity and inclusion training like we have a sexual harassment training once a year and think we're actually going to move the needle here. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to keep the dialogue going and try to find ways to sort of keep this work top of mind so that we can really engage a true equity and true inclusion as we move forward. But this clearly, there's a lot of opportunity here for improvement. And I guess I'll pause here for Laura and Andrea to comment as well.
Yeah, Dottie, not only my comment, but we did have a comment in the Q&A around this exact issue that, the majority of the respondents, 75 or so, were at the CEO level, and just how might we compare their responses to what their staffs might think. And I think especially, across larger corporations, that's quite an undertaking, but we're hoping that these report results when in the hands of those executives that filled out, the higher percentages that things are moving along greatly, we'll take a moment and pause and incorporate into the DEI practices for these companies that have already begun some sort of an assessment within their organization so that they can begin to understand deeper where are some of those differences and then address it where they can, hopefully with some infrastructure in place. But really this assessment is meant to be, as you said, foundational in the beginning, and that these are highlighting these differences is right around that exact point of making sure that we're understanding the difference between CEO and staff. So it's a good comment that one of our viewers.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, and I have to say, for us at the partnership, this is great because we said it to our board of directors, 75 CEOs this morning. So even if you think you're doing the right work, you're going to need to actually take a measurement. You're going to have to look deep in your organization. And actually, we are lucky that the Society for Human Resource Managers has developed an internal assessment, which we're going to share with these CEOs. So part of actually observing this is communicating it ourselves and saying, you can think you're doing the right thing, but this data shows that sometimes it doesn't flow all the way down. And where you don't think you're doing a good job, your staff knows you're not doing a good job. So it is an astute observation, and that's why we really, again, we never really intended to have this level of comparison, and we're so grateful that we do, because I do think it is one of the big opportunities that are coming out of this. So Andrea, is there anything you want to add to that at all, or?
No, it's just no, I totally agree with what Laura and you, Dari, said as well. And I do remember that we did have a follow-up question in the assessment with that included open-ended questions or verbatim, and both group, from the CEO or executive level and staff level, the ongoing training needed, came up as a key theme. So it's not just training, but using the word ongoing training. So I think this is really important, as you mentioned, right, when we think of opportunities in the future.
Yeah, and I think, we, preaching to the choir, everyone on this call, but, when we talk about truly building equity, that is not something you do in a committee off to the side. It's got to be a part of the organization's culture, right? So that's actually, I think, this is one indicator of what in a way that can potentially address that issue, I think. So I previewed this a little bit earlier about the focus on recruitment. And so here what you're looking at is companies that have, we asked them, what is your number one priority, right? Andrea, I got that correct, right? That number one priority. So of the organizations that have begun their D&I journey, their number one priority, 67% of them said hiring and retention. For those that had yet to begin, 58% were, tell me how to get started. And we hear a lot of that at the partnership from our member companies. But 51% next up is hiring and retention. And this to me is a challenge, because if we're not working on the culture to create an inclusive culture, and we're working on just hiring, and we're waiting until we've hired enough people to then address the culture, we're going to have all these disconnects, right? So one of the things that we think we need to sort of be leaders on and vocalize is this whole building cultural competencies within your organization and building an inclusive culture, because that's quite frankly where people want to work. And one of the telltale pieces of data that came out of the report, which really addresses this, was one of these CEO compared to staff. Activities that foster inclusion are deliberately initiated by the organization. And you can define that however you want, right? Maybe this is an observation of a cultural holiday. Maybe this is coffee with the CEO. Maybe this is employee surveys. It could be any number of things. But what this is saying is that we collectively are not doing a good job of being proactive around creating opportunities for inclusion. So this is another area where I think there's an opportunity for us to learn from one another as companies and share best practices to sort of be able to make this better, because ultimately we know we can't retain talent that we've worked so hard to recruit if we don't have an inclusive environment in which they want to work. So a lot of data here. And by the way, so what you've seen here are some of the highlights. there is deeper data in the printed report, and there's even more data that's specific around industries that we're still sort of working our way through. This we'll be able to mine a lot of good data as we move forward in the work. So what have we learned? Well, in a roundup here, we've learned that getting started in D&I work is important. And if you do it, you will create more positive perceptions among your staff. We've learned that establishing an infrastructure of any kind will advance the work in your company. And we've also learned that setting concrete goals and establishing and revising policies is the tangible next step. And I have to tell you, just full disclosure here, as the CEO of the partnership, I sort of feel like a little bit like those that can't do teach. We have a lot of work in our organization to do this. We have a bit of an infrastructure, but not formalized, and we've got a lot of work on our own to do. So we're going to be right with all of you that are just getting started. We've also learned, for those that are well on the path, that having a system to actively communicate the work is critically important. And measuring perceptions at every level of the organization is important as C-suite leaders and D&I practitioners, because there are some data you'll see in the report of if the practitioners are that's their day job, their perceptions also skew a little bit more positively. So we have to make sure that the work is really getting out there and coming up from the staff level. And we learned that continuous training at all levels of the organization is important for both staff and leadership. So there's a lot there. There's a lot there about the specifics of the kinds of policies people want to know more about, and we're going to take a lot of this information and be able to develop programs to assist companies in this work. So we got to talk about let's talk about the 6% that have no intention of starting. So, again, a reminder, in this 27% over here, you are more likely to be in construction or manufacturing. So there's a slight addition there. But what we do know, the reasons underneath the 6% are varied, right? And when you look at this, some people would say, we don't have people of color in our pipelines. We are so desperate for talent, we'll hire anyone. We know in manufacturing, for example, there's a lot of pressure with retirements. And so it's not a priority of those companies. So, and I don't know, Andrea, if you want to comment on any of the verbatims beyond that in the 6% that I haven't mentioned, but.
No, I think you mentioned, but the majority of those respondents were talking about how they need to focus on finding the right talent. And there is no, or many were mentioning there is not enough skilled, colored applicants. So those were the main reasons.
Yeah, so well, there were some others in there. We don't see color. I mean, some things that, we know if you're in the work are, that are not, not exactly right. But what I would tell you, what this told us at the partnership is we have to continue to build the case that equity is good for business. And we know, for example, that gender diverse companies are 15% more likely to outperform their peers. 80% of workers say diversity and inclusion are important when choosing a company. We know that companies with diverse teams have a 22% lower turnover rate, and so on and so on. So while we think that work is done, building the business case for diversity, and with 72% of companies saying they've started down this path, we're not done. And quite frankly, for the partnership, this is an economic imperative. When we talk about the future, we talk about economic development, when we talk about what our country is looking like and the changing demographics in our country, if we are going to be a community that can compete, we must develop more inclusive businesses here and make sure that we are doing everything we can. And I shout out to the work for our friends at the Racial Equity Roundtable, who are dealing with some of the very difficult issues around inequity on criminal justice reform and community safety and all of that. But inclusive workplaces is really the economic driver that can change our community. And so, we're going to double down on this work and make sure that everyone understands that this is not only the right thing to do, it is not the morally correct thing to do. It is better for your business to do it. So you're going to have a better time attracting talent if you can demonstrate that you have an inclusive and diverse workplace, period, end of story. So, so I guess, Laura, is there anything you want to add to anything on the results at all here?
Are you going to start talking about next steps? Because I have some thoughts just from some of the questions that folks have. So,
well, I was going to get into what we're doing to help, but we can talk about that.
No, go ahead. It'll be nice after. It'll be in that context. Sorry.
Okay, great. So how can we help? Well, right now we're taking all of this information, we're distilling it, and we're going to try to help get experts again for peer-to-peer learning. And we're already doing a number of things. For those of you that don't know, we have, I just briefly will touch on these programs. We have something called the Diversity and Inclusion Executive Exchange. That is a small peer-to-peer professionally facilitated group for senior level executives who are deep in the work. So they're actively implementing the work to learn from one another and hopefully share those best practices with us so we can share them with the rest of the community that might be a little bit behind them. We have something called the Diversity and Inclusion Academy. This is a 4-class series that really is for those companies that say, how do I get started, right? And at the end of that it's all about the sort of language and the business case for diversity and inclusion, and also really how do you get started with putting together a plan for your organization. We have limited availability. The fall session was sold out. The next one will be we're launching in January and February. And so if you're interested in that, you can reach out to us. We also are doing topical D&I events. We just are finishing up a learning series of 3 D&I topics that were important to keep the conversation going. And our annual symposium, which many of you, I think, who are on the call may have been at our event last year at the convention center. And this year's event, unfortunately, because of COVID, was postponed. But we will be having it with God willing. And if not, we got bigger problems as a country here. If by next June we can't do it all together. But we will do this annual symposium, which is really a way of bringing everyone together. So I just want to say also, you can download the report from our website. You're welcome to that. You don't need to be a member of ours to get the report. And I guess right now we can open it up for questions and discussion, Laura.
Great, thanks, Eddie. I was going to say there are a few questions in the Q&A related to very specific questions around maybe recruiting best practices, workplace best practices. And I think the slide that you just showed about the programs that we have are important, but I encourage everyone to go to the link on the last page, download the report, because that short little form that you fill out with your name and your email address is going to get you on a listserv for information around our DEI programs, blogs that we might have about best practices or tips that we can give out to folks throughout the year so that you can get more engaged in these. But like we said in the report, the best thing to do is to get started. So simply getting your name and email on that list, that's a check. You did something great today to advance your DEI initiatives. But there's a question here that I think Andrea's apt to answer around handling the different answers for the same company. When people were reporting, we mentioned earlier that some organization had multiple employees who participated. How did we handle that, Andrea?
You're on mute.
Yeah, I just realized I got the notification. Sorry about that. Yes, so we had 265 respondents and we had 250 companies represented. So we had 15 respondents that were overlapping. So probably I would say 6 or 7 companies, and we included every individual in the sample size when you look at this slide. And the overlap you will see is when it comes to comparison. So no, there's no overlap when you look at comparison between executive level versus staff level respondents. But the main goal, as Dottie mentioned previously, was to make sure that the results are projectable to the entire community, and looking at the 250 or the 265 sample size, both are representative at a 95% significance. So,
I mean, there is, there is probably a shade of bias here, in the sense that people who completed the survey are, more likely to care about this, right? So we might have a little bit of bias in that, but I do think, based on the sample size, that we can feel confident on the perceptions and what got measured here.
One other comment from the Q&A was around, could the partnership think about the landscape outside of the workplace to help create a more robust pipeline of talent, thinking about community wellness, equity activities. And I think, Dottie, we talked about the Racial Equity Roundtable, the Business Leaders Task Force piece of that, but our organization is, you and Clotilde Decker on each other's boards, and we're completely invested in each other's work in this space to advance it, getting career opportunities to folks that are maybe working with the boys and men of color, talking about the value of the careers in our community, not only out to the public, but also helping employers do that. And that's going to help advance the broader perspective of it. But I think the answer to yes.
Yeah, and I would just add, so we're not talking about everything that we do here at the partnership, but Laura runs for us a collective impact effort that we lead called Employ Buffalo Niagara, which is about removing barriers for the working poor ALICE population, and that work is slow and steady and is really about systems change. And we haven't, it's not ready to be released publicly, but it gets to the point, I think the point that the listener brought up, which is there are huge issues. This is all interrelated, right? In order to bring people into the workforce that are disenfranchised, and in Buffalo and in Niagara Falls, I mean, both, we have a disproportionately high number of people who are living in poverty and who are out of the workforce. And how do we begin to bridge that gap? And one of the things that we're working on, and Laura's leading this for us, is we are the third city that the Federal Reserve is partnering with to create what we're calling a benefits cliff calculator, but is really an economic mobility calculator. And really looking at what are the career paths that actually create true economic mobility, because and not to get off on another subject, but the benefits cliff is real, and people opt out of moving up that ladder because they have too much to lose, right? So we'll never get to economic equity without addressing that issue. So what I would say, we are 100% engaged with the work of the roundtable that has more of a community focus, but we have so much leverage right now with employers because of the work that we do, that we really feel like this is where we can have the greatest influence in moving the needle in terms of advancing equity in the region. But this is an all hands on deck issue, problem. Turn on your television, you all know this. So we are all in on this, and we have the full support of our board of directors, and we have been in this work, in the racial equity work, through Employ Buffalo Niagara for almost 5 years now. And we have invested a tremendous amount of, we have funding now from Walmart and the Community Foundation to do this, for example, but for the first 4 years of our work, our members funded all of the work that we have done in this space. So this is an economic imperative to move this community forward. If we can't get this right, we are in serious trouble. Those of you who have not read the Racial Equity Dividend Report that the Community Foundation has published, you should. It's excellent. And one of the facts in there that really sticks with me is that in Buffalo, we have a 90% isolation index. And what does that mean? We are so segregated that if you are a white person, you only have a 1 in 10 chance of having a meaningful interaction with a person of color. And that level of segregation really gets in our way in every way possible, including within workplaces, and addressing the kinds of issues that you're talking about, health disparities, educational attainment, and all of those things which are critically important. So, we're all in this together, and I know, and it's going to take longer than any of us want, but we all have to do what we can do. I don't know if I answered that person's question or not, but
yeah. And Dottie, I just wanted to mention, sometimes it's good to give a quick example of somebody making what seems to be a simple adjustment in their workplace policies that can be something little. And we had an employer engaged in our DEI activities and employed Buffalo Niagara, who was giving a $25 a month to cover their parking, realized for all of the employees that walked or took the bus, they were $25 per month short. So instead of a parking, just simply gave everyone in the organization $25 to get to work, however you choose to do that. And that's an equitable distribution, something that the employer didn't do intentionally to be have created disparity, but it was there. And so little things like that that really make a difference with your employee base you can really start to implement within your workplace.
From a tangible point of view, Laura is leading an effort here to replicate a toolkit for employers based on best practice we learned from Cincinnati. That what are those policies that you can implement if you're interested in doing this work as an employer? So we're working on that right now through Employ Buffalo Niagara, and we're excited because the Wilson Foundation is helping us fund some of that work as well. So yeah, really important stuff. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Are we good? All right. How are we doing? Look at that, 8 minutes early. Fantastic. Everyone can go have a cup of coffee and take a break. So Andrea and Laura, thank you all. Thank you both for being here. And again, I want to thank everyone who made this possible. Most importantly, the Community Foundation, Walmart Foundation, our anonymous group of business leaders, and Blue Cross Blue Shield, Crowley Webb, and our friend Tom Burns for really bringing to life and setting a good foundation for how we all work together to move the community forward. So thank you all very much, and we'll hope to see you soon. Take care.